What do Mozart and one of my favorite bands, Vulfpeck, have in common? They both like to move from a 5-7-5 to a 5-7, which in turn will require us to tweak some of our guidelines on how we resolve dominant seventh chords. We already know that the dominant seventh, or 5-7, likes to resolve to the 1 chord, and that there's a particular way in which the voice leading works when moving from a 5-7 to a 1 chord. The 5-7 is a special type of chord because it has two tendency tones. The third of the chord, which is the leading tone, wants to resolve up to the C, and the seventh of the chord, which is this F here, wants to resolve down to the E. But wait a minute. Now that we know about secondary dominants, it's possible to have a dominant seventh chord built on a scale degree other than scale degree 5. Subsequently, it's possible to have a dominant seventh chord move to another dominant seventh chord, like a 5-7-5 moving to a 5-7. Now before our heads explode, let's listen to this short clip from Vulfpeck's tune, Hero Town. Now what you just heard were 3 chords, a 5-7-5 resolving to a 5-7 and then to a 1. You also may have heard a chromatic descending line in the top voice. Let's listen one more time. Now some of you may have thought that that descending chromatic line were the sevenths resolving down for each chord, but in fact you'd only be partially correct. Let's take a look at this on the staff. Here is that progression from that Vulfpeck tune, our 5-7-5 going to a 5-7 and then a 1. And here is that descending chromatic line, F sharp, F natural, E. But notice something interesting about this F sharp. It is not the seventh of my 5-7-5. In fact, it is the third of my chord, which would normally resolve up. But since we are resolving to another dominant seventh chord, the 5-7, we're going to resolve this down, so that the third of my D7 chord becomes the seventh of my G7 chord, which then resolves properly down to the third of my C major chord. Now some of you probably noticed that my G7 chord has a couple strange notes, and in fact is completely missing the leading tone altogether. So what I'm calling the G7 is actually a type of altered chord, sometimes called the gospel chord because it's like an F over a G bass. But the important thing to remember is that the function of this chord is still dominant, and that's why I've labeled it as a 5-7 chord. Let's hear this progression on the keyboard just to help us hear and visualize this voice leading. We're going to start with our 5-7-5 in C major. So we have our root, 5th, 7th, and 3rd in the top voice. That then resolves to our 5-7, so the 3rd of my D7 resolves down to the 7th of my G chord, then it resolves down to the 3rd of my C chord. This type of voice leading is found all throughout common practice period music. And one of the reasons why I like Vulfpeck so much is that they use these time-tested voice leading concepts to make some really tasty music. The important takeaway from this video is that when you have one dominant seventh chord moving to another dominant seventh chord a fifth away, you want to resolve the third of the first chord down and not up, so that it becomes the seventh of the second chord. If you're interested in another example of these secondary dominant resolutions, make sure to check out my bonus video where I take a look at Gershwin's I've Got Rhythm.